Now, without further ado, I am going to pass the mic to Jean, and she is going to guide us through this. I'm really excited about this topic, designing better UX surveys. So Jean, take it away.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, so hopefully I can share my screen. And just to be sure I'm on the right track, you're doing networking at the end, so what time should I aim to wrap up?
Yes, thank you, Jean. I forgot to mention that. We will be having some breakout sessions after tonight's talk. So Jean's going to give her talk. We're going to field some questions about, that you put in the chat. And then we'll have networking sessions like, I don't know if this is your first time, but we have 2 breakout rooms, and then we come back for what we call a happy hour, which is whoever's left after all the breakout rooms. We just come and ask the community general questions. So generally for the first hour, so Jean, we are very flexible on time. Go over, that is great. We'll make it work for sure. So generally about the first hour, and then for those who are not super comfortable about networking, we'll give you time to fall off, but we'd really love for you to join us too. So please, welcome Jean. Give her a little applause emoji.
All right, thank you so much. And I assume you can see the screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I am really excited to be here today too. I don't hear too much about UX designing surveys, although there's some really great work happening, which we'll talk about tonight, but they are a really big important aspect of the work that we do. So I'm excited to be sharing this, and I'm eager to hear your questions and talk with you some more at the end. So, all right, let me figure out how, sometimes, there we go. Just to give you some background about myself, I came from, I have an undergraduate degree in human factors, so I've been doing this work for a long time. I worked for a couple of years at American Institutes for Research, which is a consulting company in the Boston area, or now all over. I went to graduate school, and then after graduate school, I ended up at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. At BLS, we do things like we produce the Consumer Price Index, which has been in the news a lot lately. That's the rate of inflation that typically we hear about. We've also heard about the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is part of the jobs report. So these are really important metrics of how our economy is doing related to labor. So it's a really great mission, and I'm really happy there. For a lot of our data, we use surveys to collect our data. So I've been doing a lot of work with surveys, and it turns out, it was funny when I started there, I found out that a lot of my colleagues were survey methodologists, and they had PhDs in survey methodology. And so I would tell them, like, who knew you could get a PhD in survey methodology? And they said, who knew you could get a PhD in user experience? So along the way, we've been learning a lot from each other. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a lot what I've learned from them and the research and my experience with designing a lot of surveys at BLS. Before I get into surveys, I do want to give a little bit of plug for UX in government. There's a lot of great work being done in the government. There's some more, they would call it human factors work being done in the military and the transportation. There's a lot of great UX work. All the government agencies have websites, systems, and services, and at all levels of government, there's some neat stuff happening at the state and local level as well. Some agencies have innovation labs that are using a human-centered design approach for innovation, which I think is just really, really cool. And the work is rewarding, fun, interesting, and I've got great colleagues. So I know that's not really what we're here to talk about, but I just wanted to give it a plug. This is US work. I see we have people from all over the world. There's great UX work happening in governments all over. If somebody's got their not on mute, could you mute, please? Thanks very much. Okay, so I think we probably all know what surveys are, but just to be sure we're all on the same page. A survey is basically a protocol where you're looking for information from groups of people in a systematic way. The goal is to generalize the information you get from those small groups to get estimates of the larger population. We could sort of talk about the Venn diagrams of questionnaires versus surveys versus even polls, but just for the sake of today, let's consider kind of they're all kind of the same. It's basically we're going to be asking questions, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today is those questions. Interviews and focus groups to some extent would benefit from what we're going to be talking about, but they're a little bit different. But some of the concepts and thought process that goes into developing the questions would apply to interviews and focus groups as well. The questionnaires and surveys are generally given online or paper, and it's important when you are sort of looking at them and evaluating them that you do look at it in that final mode that you're going to be giving it in, because sometimes things go differently, like as you're transitioning from paper to online. In UX, we use surveys in a lot of different ways. I use them all the time in usability tests. I usually have 1 or 2 post-test questions and a couple of post-test questions as well. We use them in ethnographic work where we're going to ask people about what they're doing. And it could be part of an interview, but it could also be a survey that we give them either before, so we have a better idea of what their situation is, or afterwards. We use them in stakeholder feedback a lot. We do a lot of surveys of our data users to get input from them. And there could be more market research type surveys that are more looking at like, how are people using your product, or how are people using other products, and get input about that. So we're using surveys a lot in UX. So what I want to talk about today is why it's important to think about survey design. We're going to learn some things from survey methodology that apply to surveys in UX, and share some best practices for designing and testing surveys as well. We'll cover selecting the topics, writing survey questions, and some of the different kinds of questions that we might use in a UX survey, and then a little bit about testing the survey questions. There are plenty of topics about surveys we won't be covering today, at least in much detail. The first issue is sampling, and that is making sure that you are inviting all of the right people to complete your survey. And making sure, or at least evaluating who's responding. We talk about non-response a lot at BLS, and we look at, is there a non-response bias? That is, are we getting skewed data because not everybody in certain groups are responding? So that's something to pay attention to. We also will be talking about motivation, like what makes people want to complete surveys, and what can you do in presenting your survey and presenting the invitation to help encourage people to fill them out. And I will give you a hint, though, there is no silver bullet that will get everybody to fill out your survey, although we're trying to find that. And then do incentives help? They are not a silver bullet, but there are cases where incentives may help, and they may be monetary, or they may be, for us, it may be things like providing them access or showing them where the data are that they might find helpful. I'm not going to be talking about data cleaning, which is how do you decide if a response is valid and whether a whole respondents' responses are valid, like whether they're just giving you the first response and everything, and whether they're really paying attention. And also, what do you do with outliers? And this is especially an issue if any of you are using like mTurk or something like that. The data cleaning is a big issue, because there's can be a good percentage of the responses that may be questionable. I would encourage you to see Carolyn Jarrett's presentation on planning surveys. She covers a lot of the sampling and other planning issues, and she does a great job. And to sort of follow on with that, she did not pay me to say this, but she's just published a book on surveys that work to follow up to her book Forms That Work. So it's got some great input, and this is not marketing or just saying that this is out there. And Jeff Sora and Jim Lewis at measuringu.com have some great blog posts on surveys, studies related to survey design. So we heard a little bit about why we might talk about them, but there's some reasons why we probably don't talk about them very much. They're not new. They've been around for a long time. They're not really cool. but they are everywhere. And it turns out it's pretty easy to do them poorly. And so it's important, if we're going to be making decisions based on the data we get, that we do design them well. So for the next couple of slides, I'm going to look at some examples of surveys that have problems. And if you are ever want to go down a rabbit hole on the web, there's a lot of places to do that. But I recommend Bad Survey Question, a Twitter feed that has, where a lot of these came from, where people post what are often very poor survey questions. So I've got a couple here, some from my own experience as well, but so I do want to go over them. And if I were in person, we would sort of talk about what you see and what's working, what's not. But since we're not in person, I just encourage you to sort of read through it and think about what you might think is a problem with the survey or with the question. I'll point out some of them. For this question, the scale is inconsistent. The question is, how was your experience today? And I've grayed out more specific details about where the survey came from. Neither good nor poor, very satisfied, or poor. So the scale goes from satisfied to poor, and those are not consistent within the scale. The options appear to be randomly ordered, not along the continuum. And not all options answer the question directly. And this is something that will come up a couple of times, that when you have the survey, think about it as a conversation between you and your respondent, so that you ask a question and the response options that you provide should be direct answers to that question. So if you think about it, if someone said, how was your experience today? You might say poor, or you might say very poor. You probably wouldn't say satisfied. So those would not be good responses to this particular question. And just to give you another example of where the responses are not a good answer to the question, this one is, during your most recent visit, how satisfied you were with the following COVID-19 measures in store? And the response scale is strongly disagree to strongly agree. Again, those responses don't answer the question. You can probably figure out what they're getting at and what you might answer, but it's kind of an awkward conversation. Here's another example. This is a more graphic scale. The text says, I don't care about sports. I don't understand how some people are so obsessed. And there's a couple of problems with this one. First, we'll talk about, this is a double-barreled question, and we'll talk about them a little bit more. But for me personally, I care a little bit about sports, but I don't understand how people can be so obsessed. So how would I answer this question? So it's not an easy way. Also, I think that the color and the icons in the scale will probably bias people to select the green checkbox as opposed to not selecting the red X. And also, and I didn't even see this at first, but there is a neither agree nor disagree option that is in the lower right-hand corner that is not part of the scale and not very salient at all. I looked, there's a more recent version of the same scale that has similar issues. The midpoint is a little bit easier to see, but still not as salient as the two extremes. Here's another example. This is a slider, and there's a number of issues with sliders. The first one I'll mention is, it says on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you miss going to the theater? And at first this looks okay, but if you think about it, it's hard to tell a non-response from a 5 because some of the sliders, you pick a default value and the default value is there whether the respondent selects it or not. There are some other designs where sort of the slider starts off of the scale and then the person has to move it onto the scale, or the person has to actually click on it to select it. Those are better designs, but with some sliders, this can be an issue. The other issue is that if you think about the actual midpoint of a 1 to 10 scale, it's not 5. So this is going to skew your results because people are going to, could select the 5 thinking that it's the midpoint, because it sure looks like the midpoint here. Here's another example. The question says, which of the following best describes how you feel about the aircraft you just flew? And the responses are, I would actively avoid flying this aircraft again. I don't want to fly this aircraft again. I would like to fly this aircraft again. And I would go out of my way to fly this aircraft again. So if you think about this, and think about how you might answer this. For me, my response actually, was not on the scale, which is that I don't really care so much about which aircraft I'm in as long as it's clean and safe and I have enough room. So that option is missing. There's also thinking about, suppose this were a required question. What would I do? I would either end the survey or I would give you bad data because none of these are the right answer for me. So this isn't required, but it's something to think about is which questions are required because it can, if you don't have all the options or if somebody gets frustrated, it's easy for them to just drop out of your survey, and you don't want to do that if you can encourage them to keep going. Okay, I have one more example. This is, what is the age of your youngest child? 0 to 3 months, 4 to 6 months, 1 to 2 years, 3 to 4 years, and then a couple of other years up to 15. This is an example of an issue that happens a lot when we've got groupings like this. It happens for us, we do some surveys with where we're looking for income. It can happen with that as well. And the issue is that there are some ages in this that don't have an appropriate category. For example, if your child is 8 months old, what do you select? There's also the issue of if their child is 2.5 years old. I suspect the authors of this were thinking you would probably pick 2, but sort of technically 2 ends, like once you're past your 2nd birthday, you are older than 2. So we usually try to use language of like 0 up to 3, 3 up to 6 months, and things like that. So it's very clear where one ends, where one group ends and where the next one begins. So we've seen some designs that are maybe difficult for respondents and may not get you the data you want. So because you may be making important decisions based on your survey results, you want to be sure that your results are valid and give you really good data so that you're making good decisions. And we have seen that designing good surveys is not common sense, or they would have all been designed beautifully. So we're going to look at some of the, take some input from the academic research and survey methodologists and talk a little bit more about building and designing your survey. So I want to start with the content for the survey, so sort of overall, the topics that you're going to be covering. So you're starting from scratch, and what is it that you want to ask about in your survey? Well, let's start with what you really need to know. I have fallen into this trap too, and it happens pretty frequently where you have a lot of things you want to look at, a lot of things you want to input on, and you start adding things like, oh, this would be really interesting. Oh, and this would be really interesting too. Let's ask this question. And then all of a sudden you have a lot of questions, you have a long survey, you have a lot of questions that would be interesting. You don't need to have the information, but as long as you're doing the survey, you might as well ask this other question. And I encourage you to be careful with that because it's really easy for surveys to get really long. What happens also is you get responses to those questions and you don't know how to use them. You don't have a plan for what you're going to do with that information or how you're going to use that information to make decisions. So before you go in, have clear research questions established ahead of time so you know what it is you need to have answered. And don't ask things that just might be interesting. It's really tempting, I know, but try not to ask them because you don't want people to take the time to complete surveys when you're not going to use their data. Also think about, are you asking for information that you can get from somewhere else? Like, are you looking for in general, the kinds of pages that people are going to on your website. Well, that's something you can get from analytics. It may be some work to get it, but it's better for you to do the work than ask your respondents to do the work. The next issue is, are you asking questions that your target audience can answer? You may be asking questions that they don't know the answer, or they may not remember the answer, or they may not have access to the information they need to answer the question. So just be sure you understand who the target audience is, so that you can provide, you can build your questions and know that they can provide good data. Also, as in with any research, it's good to have a plan for how you're going to analyze the data before you start collecting a lot of data, because you want to be sure that you're collecting it in a way that's useful, that the values you're collecting are useful, and you can do the analysis that you need to. This is especially important for open-ended questions, because they can be very, very tedious to answer, to analyze. So you want to be sure you are only asking open-ended questions that you really plan to do the analysis for. Because if you have, even if you have just 3 open-ended questions, if you have 100 people filling out your survey, that's 300, potential for up to 300 open-ended responses that you have to figure out how to code. So just make sure you know how you're going to analyze your data before you start your survey. Okay, so we're going to go into, we have our topics, we're going to go into writing questions. The one thing I do want to talk about before we get too into detail of the questions is a survey response model. It's a model that survey methodologists have been using for a while. And it breaks down the steps of interpreting and responding a question into four phases. First, there's comprehension, where the respondent is reading and understanding the question. Retrieval, where they're looking for the information that they need to respond, whether that's something that they have in their memory or something they have to look up. Then is judgment. So based on this information they've gathered, they're deciding on their answer. And finally is the response, where they have their answer and then they have to map it to, do you have a scale? Is it an open-ended question? So they have to just sort of tailor their answer to the format that you have for the responses. So for the next few minutes, I want to talk about some best practices. There's a lot of issues that we could talk about here, but I want to focus on rating scales, rankings, double-barreled questions, and agree-disagree questions. These are topics that come up a lot in UX work, and I sometimes review surveys for not for BLS sort of program surveys, but like our data user surveys or stakeholder surveys, and also for other people. And these are the kinds of issues that come up a lot in those kinds of surveys. So we probably all know what a rating scale is, but just to be sure, it's basically a continuum of one construct where the response options cover the full range of the continuum. You may have a don't know or not applicable options. They would be included generally at the end of the scale because they're not part of the continuum. It's also not a list of categories. It's something that is ordinal, and there is kind of an order to the options. So some general guidance for rating scales. We saw this earlier, that the response options should directly answer the question posed. And so think about it like if it were an open-ended question, would those response labels be appropriate for that question? And choose the qualifiers, and by the qualifiers, I mean the terms like not at all, very, somewhat, moderately, to create an evenly distributed scale. Now, there's been some research into the kind of assigning values to these qualifiers, and I've done some work recently on this as well. There's not really a clear, like, this is the 5-point scale, this is the 7-point scale. There's not a clear solution to that. So just do the best you can. The research kind of shows that the effectiveness of the choice of the qualifiers kind of depends on the question and the construct that you're evaluating and the context. And so just do the best you can with this. And make sure to cover the full range of options. So we'll talk about two types of rating scales, that sort of categorizing them. All of them will fall into one or the other. The first is a bipolar scale, where the ends of the scale are opposites. The example here is strongly agree to strongly disagree. When you create these bipolar scales, you want to be sure that the ends are opposites. And because sometimes as we saw the example earlier where it was from poor to satisfied, those are not opposites and should not be in the same scale. Frequently, the scales for bipolar are like strongly agree to strongly disagree, or very not X to very X, or easy to difficult, something like that. They're often called Likert type scales. The other type of rating scale is a unipolar scale. And this is different because instead of going from a negative to a positive or one extreme to another, it goes from 0 to a lot. So here you can see not at all helpful to extremely helpful. And the difference here is if you want to know, is the documentation helpful? If the documentation was really bad and kept sending people down the wrong path, you may want to see if the documentation is unhelpful, in that it's making the task harder. But typically for something like this, there's not really a negative component to it. It's either just not helpful, or it's on the scale up to extremely helpful. So those are the two sort of formats of scales that we think about. One thing about the unipolar scale, here's an example. How useful would you find the following content formats? And this is a brief overview. Now the scale is not useful at all, somewhat useful, and then there's this neutral in the middle. And then it says useful and very useful. And there's a couple of problems with this. First of all, neutral doesn't answer the question. How useful would you find the content? Neutral, you just wouldn't answer that. But more importantly, it's not on the continuum. There is no neutral between nothing and a lot. You could have a no opinion option, you could have a not applicable option, but those should be outside of the scale at the end. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the size of the scale. How many response options should there be? In general, scales with 3 points probably don't give you enough response options. There's not any intensity. If you're thinking about a bipolar scale, you'd have a negative, a neutral, and a positive. So there's no kind of valence to that. What ends up happening is there's a lower reliability. Probably what's happening is people would think, well, I'm a little bit positive, so I don't know if I should select neutral or if I should select positive. And so different respondents would make that choice differently, and so you get kind of not great data. Whereas if you have 5 points, you have an option for a little bit positive. I like 5-point bipolar scales. For UX work, I don't know that people need 7 options, but that seems to work well, and it really depends on the survey. And so think about the respondents, the context, and the construct that you're measuring. In particular, for some constructs, experts may be able to differentiate more differences and may be able to take advantage of a larger scale. I tend to actually like 4 points on a unipolar scale, which was this example here. It's really hard to find. I mean, maybe you could have like a little helpful, might be a good option between not at all and somewhat, but it's hard to know how different those are. So I tend to use a 4-point scale for a unipolar scale, but again, that's up to you. One thing that the size of the rating scale does determine is whether there's an odd or even number of options. On bipolar scales, an odd number gives you a midpoint. And there's a lot of discussion in the survey methodology world about whether you should have a midpoint or not, with some concern being that people will just choose that because it's easy. For me, in UX work, I think a midpoint is a valid response, and I think we should give it to the respondents. So I almost always use a midpoint. If there's something where you really want to know which way they're leaning, and you want to force them to choose, then you can do it without the midpoint. But personally, for the work, for most UX work, I think a midpoint is helpful. Response labels. Should we label all of the response options? If you've got a scale like frequency, that's where the intervals are not equal, because you might be talking about rarely, annually, monthly, weekly, daily. So those are you really want to label all of those because they are very different. If you've got a subjective scale like agree to disagree, or the usefulness, it may be okay to just label the endpoints, but you do at least need to label the endpoint anchors. I tend to avoid using numbers. I prefer text labels because the numbers don't really provide any meaning beyond letting you know that they're sort of intended to be equal intervals. So I don't use numbers very much, but if you find them to be meaningful, that's okay. I do avoid negative numbers because people don't like to be negative. They don't like to pick negatives. So unless there's a reason to use it in your survey, I would recommend trying to use text labels if possible. We talked about making sure the scale is balanced. Here is a bipolar scale from agree to disagree. You can see that it's maybe not balanced. There are 3 agree options and 2 disagree options. So sort of by default, you're more likely to get an option where the respondent agrees. And also the agree options are very strong, and the disagree is a little bit more milder. So be sure that your scale is balanced and you have the same number of positive and negative options. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is ratings versus rankings. And this is an issue that I think this is really confusing sometimes, because I see people talking about ranking when they mean rating and talking about rating when they mean ranking. So in a rating, it's where you're selecting a value for each item. So you're using the scale, you're providing a value for each item on the list. In ranking, you're going to take all of the items on the list, compare them against all of the others, and determine an order for all of those items. And to sort of give you an example of what can happen when they get confused, here's a question that unfortunately I came in to do the analysis on. So the question reads, you are going on a diet and need to stop eating certain foods. Rate the following foods from 1 to 10, where 1 is the first food you would give up and 10 is the last food you would give up. So normally in person, I would ask how many people think this is a rating question and how many people think this is a ranking question. You can think for yourself what you think this might be. This is not the question that I got, but it's a sort of a generic representation of that question. So I had to look at the data and determine whether somebody had ranked the items or rated the items. It turns out that 57% of the respondents ranked them, 37% rated them, 2% I couldn't tell, because what I did was, if they gave everything a 10, like I'm not giving anything up, then that was clearly a rating. If they used 1 through 10, 1 for each of the items, that was clearly a ranking. And then looking at kind of working my way towards the middle of, if there were a bunch of 10s and a bunch of 9s, again, that was a rating. If there was a good sample of a ranking scale or ranking like 1, 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, that was clearly a ranking. But then I had to do the analysis separately because there's not a good way to combine them. So a good lesson for reviewing and testing questions and making sure not only that people understand them, but that you are able to use the data from the question. Ranking is difficult because it requires so many comparisons. It's not just dealing with one item at a time, but one item compared to all the others, then the next item compared to all the others. So it can be really difficult, especially with a longer list. Sometimes the data you get are less useful because if you've got, this is ranked ranked first and this is ranked second, you don't know if they're like really close or if they're really far apart. So that may not be so useful. I would recommend, if you can, use ratings instead, and then develop your rankings from the average ratings. If you do need people to make decisions, then I would recommend rankings. For example, if you're looking at, we've got this new money, what is the next feature we should build? Then you want people to make those difficult decisions about which is first. Even if the second one is really close behind, you still need to know what they think is first. So that would be a case where ranking would be appropriate. So double-barreled questions, we saw that a little bit earlier in the example. It's where you are asking respondents to provide a single response to what may truly be multiple questions. And here's one that's like really a quadruple or quintuple double-barreled question. It says, how would you rate your ability to plan and evaluate, to organize work, set priorities, and determine the resources you need to accomplish your job? That's a lot for one rating. Typically what happens is people who write these questions assume that all of these things logically go together and will have the same response. That may or may not be true. And it's important to think about that before you commit to a double-barreled question. In order to address double-barreled questions, it's important to find them first, because sometimes they can be a little bit sneaky and you may not recognize that they're double-barreled. So I would recommend watching for and in questions and seeing if you think it really is a double-barreled question. If it is, sometimes it's easy enough just to break them into multiple questions. Sometimes you have so many that ends up being a lot of questions. If you've got a couple of triple-barreled questions, all of a sudden you have 6 questions. Maybe what you can do is focus on 1 or 2 constructs that are most important to you and ignore the rest. Or it may be that it's okay, that people really do think of these things together and that you do want that higher level rating. And so that's fine. And so just be aware that that's what you've done. The last item for writing questions that I want to talk about is agree, disagree items. We use them a lot. I use them a lot because they're easy to write. You can cover a lot of items in one scale, on one grid, on one page. So that seems really great. The scale is pretty standard. People are familiar with it. We see these kinds of questions everywhere. A couple of things to consider about them, though, is that in some cases, people like to be agreeable. So there may be the acquiescence bias where they're likely to want to agree with whatever you're saying. They also require an additional level of cognitive processing because you have to translate your response not just to a scale, for example, easy to difficult, but to an agree, disagree scale. So that may not be so difficult, but just something to think about as you're writing your questions. So instead, as you're writing agree, disagree items, I suggest avoiding qualifiers like very. In this example, I thought the task was very easy. What ends up happening is, if this question said, I thought the task was easy, you could use the strongly agree would kind of map to was really easy, and agree would map to easy. Whereas when you've got this very easy here, like what if I thought it was a little bit easy? Like how do I just agree with it, or do I disagree with it because I didn't think it was very easy, but I thought it was kind of easy? So if you avoid the qualifiers in the statements, that will help make the responses a little bit more clear. If there's a good alternative, consider a construct-specific response. So, for example, here's the statement, the product was easy to use. So instead of using that, you might use a very easy to very difficult scale with the question, was the product easy or difficult to use? Another advantage of this approach is that the responses, the construct you want them to evaluate is in the responses. So it's another cue of what you're looking for. You may not want to do this if you have a lot of items you want input on, because you can end up with a lot of different scales, but it's something to think about. Okay, so summarizing the best practices for designing and writing questions. Consider the survey as a conversation with the respondents. Be sure that the responses match the question. We didn't talk about jargon at all, but avoid it unless the respondents are familiar with it and they expect it, in which case you should absolutely use it. Use the required questions carefully. Rating scale options should be evenly distributed, balanced, and follow a continuum. And for rating scales, consider the text labels that you want to use. Make sure they're appropriate for the question, either anchors only at the end or labeling all of the options. Be sure to include all of the possible options. Be sure the scales are complete, that you cover all the full range, and use don't know, not applicable, no opinion, or other as appropriate, and keep them separate from the scale itself. If you can use ratings, I encourage ratings rather than rankings. They're a little bit easier for respondents. Avoid double-barreled questions, and consider using construct-specific formats rather than agree, disagree, if that fits into your survey. So there's one last thing I want to finish up so we have some time for questions, but testing the surveys. We want to be sure that the questions are measuring what we want them to measure. And just like any other design effort where we use design best practices, but we still do usability testing, that's what we want to do here. We're going to use survey design best practices, but we still want to test the survey. Some of the kinds of problems that you can run into, you can have complicated instructions and question wording so that people don't know what you're asking. You can be using unfamiliar jargon. You can make incorrect assumptions about what your respondents know or what they can have access to. You may find that some topics are sensitive that you hadn't expected. And so that may impact their interest in completing the survey or ability to provide reliable responses. Some questions may be difficult to answer. People may interpret things in a different way than you expect. Or there may be answers that are difficult to recall. And there's a lot of other things that could go wrong as well. So as a first step, review the survey in whatever tool you're using just to make sure you catch everything glaring. Because if you're going from paper to an online survey, it may look different and feel different than it does on paper. So here's just an example of clearly there was a cut and paste issue where they used a grid for a question. They copied it. They didn't change the grid. They just changed the rows. The question is, does your institute provide mandatory or optional information security training? And the column labels are yes and no, and then the rows are basically yes or no options. So that would be caught easily when you take a look at it. To test surveys, we use a method called cognitive interviewing. It's really similar to usability testing, but with some important differences. I did a paper with some colleagues that's in the UXPA magazine about a year ago on cognitive interviewing and comparing it to usability testing. That will give you some additional ideas about what to focus on in cognitive interviewing. Basically, the format is similar. You have the participant complete the survey, then you ask them some questions, and then you interpret their responses and figure out what was working and what's not working with the survey. These questions, or what the survey methodologists call probes, are, it turns out, really the focus of the analysis. They're not so interested in the behaviors. They're not so interested in like what their responses were. They're more interested in what their responses to the probes were, because there's no way to know if their responses to the questions were right or not. The probes that they ask are things like, in your own words, what is the question asking? What did you consider in determining your response? Were there responses that you decided not to use? Or were there things that you decided, if you're asking for a count, were there things you didn't include in your account? Or is there anything difficult about this question? So this is where the bulk of the rich qualitative data for the cognitive interview comes from. So in summary, decide what you really need to know and write the questions for those topics. Write the questions following best practices, and then always test the survey. And that's it. And hopefully we have time for a few questions.
Yeah, Jean, thank you so much. Woo, there's a lot there. That was so fantastic. Oh, I'm just blown away. Let me just say that. Let me pull up the questions here. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we're gonna start throwing Jean some questions. So if anybody has any questions, please throw them in the chat and we will add them to the list. So Jean, the first one, where can people learn more about survey sampling?
Okay. All right. I hate to say it depends, but I would start with Carolyn Jarrett's work because that's really tailored to a UX audience. If you want to get it more into like the statistics of it, then there are JPSM, the Joint Program in Statistical Methodology, I think, has some short courses that there's probably one on sampling. That's not my area, so I haven't followed it so much. But from a UX perspective, I would start with Carolyn's book, and she's got some presentations online is a good starting point.
Okay, great. That's perfect. So Jean, do you have any tips on wording or ways to write questions to make synthesis easier? Like if you want to try, the example is if you're trying to avoid open-ended questions so the data is cleaner or graphable.
Yeah, that's a great question. There is a good trick for doing that, which is if you can do some pilot testing with the open-ended questions. And depending on your sample size, a couple of people, 15, 20, I don't know how many you'd need, but you can ask the open-ended questions and you can see what kind of responses you get. And then you can create those multiple choice options from what you're seeing in the open-ended questions. And that will give you a starting point to help you kind of narrow down the analysis in the end, because they'll have some categories that make sense and that will be based on data that you get from your target audience.
All right, great. So Jean, how do you feel about NPS?
Oh gosh. As a government agency, we don't use it. It's kind of a weird thing to ask, like, would you recommend BLS to your friends? Like, if they were interested in the inflation rate, you might. So we don't use it. I know it's very controversial. I don't have a good answer about yes, use it, or no, don't use it. To me, it's not the question I'm most interested in. Like I said, there's so many reasons why you would or wouldn't recommend a site that I don't know what that tells you, but I know people are, it seems to be useful in a lot of areas. So I'm sorry, I don't have more. It's just not something that we use in the government, or
Okay.
in our agency at least.
Sure. Okay, that's great. So do you ever have any concerns, Jean, about over planning how to analyze your open-ended questions? So the possibility is of biasing yourself toward different categories or results versus organic affinity mapping.
I guess not. Like I don't think that's been an issue for me personally. It's probably something I should think about more, but you know, we just kind of go in and do analysis like we would for any other qualitative data, and just kind of start developing categories that will continue to change as you go through the analysis. I think you just have to be objective as you do it.
Okay, great, thank you. So are there different considerations for different countries or cultures or languages that you'd like to point out?
Yes, probably, especially in terms of the design of the form. There's been, if you think of the survey as a form, there's been some work done for international audiences and different cultures on how, like, where the labels go. Like usually above the box works for more cultures than having the labels to one side or the other. again, most of my audience is the US, and that's probably a little bit of a cop-out, but so that's not something that has been something that we've had to focus on. But that is probably something I should look into some more. So I don't have a good answer, but there are some concerns, at least in the design of the survey form.
Sure. Have you ever had to design any surveys in multiple languages?
I have not, no.
Okay. Okay. So, how do you avoid cognitive overload when it comes to surveys?
That gets to the question of determining the topics that you have in the surveys, and making sure that you are only including what you really need. And I have one survey that I have in my mind now that I'm thinking of, that I'm working on. It's really long. So I know that I need to cut it, but it's so hard because it's like you get kind of attached to the questions, and but really go through and you know that if you test it with participants, you can see, like, is it really overloading the participants, or is it a topic they're really interested in and they're happy to spend some time on it. So I think doing your best to make the survey as short as possible, but then doing testing and seeing, you can also find out which questions are the most burdensome, and then maybe consider eliminating those.
Okay, great. So, Jean, is there anything to consider when designing a survey that could be taken on a computer versus a mobile device?
Yes. And I think a lot of what a lot of the best practices for designing on mobile devices are things that we need to consider in the survey world too, which is, paging is different and the selection is different. And, it may feel longer on a phone than it does on a computer. If you're doing a grid with, rows and multiple columns, that becomes a little bit more burdensome on a mobile device. And so a lot of the survey tools will adjust automatically. So if you build a grid, it will display as a grid on a laptop, but if you're on a mobile device, it divides it into individual questions. And so that experience is going to be a little bit different. So it gets back to making sure you look at it in all of the modes that you think people are going to be completing the survey.
Okay, great. So, Jean, do you have any sources of survey templates or survey samples that you like to start from or have as a frame of reference to get started?
I don't really. Most of the times, the stuff we do is so unique that we're sort of starting from scratch and using kind of what we have learned in the past, but not so much relying on survey questions. There is a government template, or there was a group from U.S. government statistical agencies where they were kind of sharing data, but I think that's, I'm not sure where that is. It wasn't something that we participated in, but so mostly no, we unfortunately start from scratch or start from an existing survey that we're going to be revising. So okay. I don't have any good examples. I know some of the online survey tools have examples to start with, but I have to admit I have not used them.
Okay, that's fair. So what are your thoughts, Jean, on having a please explain your answer kind of open-ended question at the end at the end?
I think it's fine. I would be careful about overusing it. I would also be careful about overusing please, because we do that a lot. Like, so just it's certainly appropriate. We do want to say please, but just be sure you're not saying please for every single question, because it gets it kind of feels like you're begging a little bit. So it just gets a little bit repetitive. So I think it's fine to say please explain your answer, because it just don't make it required. They either will or they won't, and you could get some interesting data that way.
Okay. So what is the best way to measure how long a survey should be, like the number of questions or pages?
Yeah, I think that gets back to testing and looking with your target population. And what you think they'd be interested in. Some of my colleagues do a lot of work in using MTurk. And so they are like, the surveys are like, 2 or 3 minutes and that's it. And sometimes 10 minutes, but you have to pay more for that. There's no good like 10 questions and that's it. But I would try to, you have to think, I know I hate saying it depends, but that's so often the answer in UX is that, you have to think about the users. If it's a topic they're really interested in and excited about, they might be willing to spend more time. And if it's for an organization that they want to support. So that I think there's a lot to consider, but I think the testing, getting a couple of people to run through it, even if they're your friends, just to get them to run through it and see if there's anything that's problematic.
Okay. So, Jean, we had lots of questions about the bipolar scale. Do you have recommendations on like the negative being on the right or the left, the small being on the right or the left, the setup of those kind of bipolar Likert kind of situations?
Yeah, I have been looking for the study that would definitively state. The last thing I read was from Measuring You, and their conclusion seemed to be that it didn't matter a whole lot. There is a little bit of a bias to pick from the left-hand side, but I don't think we have the answer of how it should be all the time, and it's something that I struggle with for every survey, because sometimes neither one seems right.
Do you generally have negative on the left or the right?
I do, and usually if you've got like a single question and the scale below, it kind of makes sense. I sort of struggle a little if you've got like I don't know if you can even see my hands, but the item on the left and then the scale on the right, where you kind of want like what's closest to the scale to be most relevant to the scale. But usually I do put negative on the left.
Okay. And low numbers too. You kind of put the low.
And low numbers. Vertical scales are complicated too. Like I guess you'd put, I don't know, maybe it depends on the topic, whether you put the low numbers on the top or the bottom.
Okay. So, Jean, what's a good sample size to be considered like an accurate data finding?
It depends on the size of your universe. If I do a lot of work in-house for our analysis systems where we've got 40 or 50 users, and so if I can get input from 10 of them, that's a great sample. If you've got 1 million users, you're going to probably want a much larger sample. It also depends on, as with sort of usability testing, if they're more homogeneous, you probably don't need so many responses. I don't have a good answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
No,
usually it's as many as you can get.
That's
is
fair.
what we aim for.
Yeah. Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, there's no silver bullet to get people to fill in a survey, right? So you do the best that you can.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe just a couple more questions, Jean.
Okay.
Cool. So, so what are the rules of etiquette about the types of questions that should be required? Do you have any?
For especially UX surveys, I like to keep them really to a minimum. And so if there's like one question, like this is the question that you really need an answer to, that should probably be required, because if you don't have that, then you have no data. If it's a screener where it's going to determine which path you go down, and there's no clear path if they don't pick something, that will need to be required. But in general, I try for UX surveys, try to make nothing required except for those two, anything that's critical or that will determine a path forward.
Okay. So do you have any resources or recommendations on how to analyze the data from surveys?
Let me get back to you on that, because
Okay.
that's important. And I work with a lot of statisticians, so that's my resource, but that's not very helpful to this audience. Yeah, if it's okay, let me get back to you on that. In general, I think of it as either quantitative data or qualitative data, and so whatever approaches you use for those methods would apply. Like the open-ended questions are really just qualitative data, and however you analyze qualitative data, looking through, finding themes, and sometimes you have to go back through because you find themes later on that you didn't recognize earlier in your analysis. And it also depends on how many participants you have for the quantitative analysis, that you need to have enough responses. If you're going to do more in-depth statistical analysis, you need to have enough participants to be able to do that.
All right, great. So last question, Jean, is about offering incentives like rewards, gift cards. How do you feel about that? And does it introduce any self-selection bias? And do you feel like it increases completion rates? So what are your thoughts around incentives?
There is some evidence that incentives do help. Typically, they're given when you send out the survey. Well, I should say a lot of the work was done on paper, and so those were sent out with the survey. There is some evidence that they help. We generally are not allowed to use them in the government for surveys. We can use them for usability testing, but not for surveys. So I don't have much experience with incentives in surveys myself. We tend to more focus on the language we use in the invitations to encourage people to participate. And we try to give them, like, as I said, other incentives that are, here's our great data that we have. And it might be really useful to you. And sometimes that works. So I don't have any specific data on incentives. They can be helpful in certain situations. I don't know how they'd impact the results. That is a good question.
Okay.
But we use them for usability testing too. And I don't know if there's much research on how they impact usability testing.
Yeah, interesting. All right, I had one more late breaking question, Jean, and then
Sure.
and then we'll wrap the questions up. When should you prioritize a drop down with choices over showing all the choices?
Yeah, it depends on two things. Well, yeah, one is like how many there are, and that's the crux of the question. But it also depends on the layout and how much room you have. I prefer to show all the options because it helps clarify sometimes what the question is asking. But if it gets much beyond 4 or 5, then I would go to a drop down myself. But there are cases also where even if it's just one or two, not one or two, like 2 or 3 or 4 options, you may not have the room for showing all the options. If it's just yes or no, I kind of don't like having that as a drop down unless it's clear that there's a space issue. But yeah, I would say 4 or 5. You know, it depends on, you know, if you've got 6, you know, if you've got the space, I might consider putting them. There's not really a one cutoff, I don't think. After this, I would definitely, I mean, after, you know, probably 15, I would definitely go to a drop down, but there's some gray area in between.
Okay, that's fair. Well, thank you again, Jean. Everybody give her like a visual or emoji applause, because this was a fantastic presentation and she gave so many great answers to your questions. So thank you so much. We are going to hop over to the networking portion of this evening. So Jean, you're welcome to join us, or you're welcome to step aside for the evening. Again, thank you for your time, and we loved having you. And for those who are interested in networking, stay on, and we're going to go ahead and pull up the questions and transition to that. Thanks again, Jean.
All right, thank you. I can stay on for a little bit. So.
Okay, great. Awesome. Yeah. All right. Jean, I'm gonna have to ask, there we go. I'm gonna have to ask you to stop sharing for a second.
Sorry, I thought I had done that already.
Nah, well, it didn't think so, but now we are good. Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen. Right. So we have a few house rules for our networking. So we're going to break out into 2 breakout rooms for 12 to 15 minutes into smaller groups. And we're going to have a couple different topics that we're going to talk about. And we ask that everybody treats each other with respect and give everyone a chance to speak. And have your LinkedIn. Did I skip a slide? Ooh, I might have. Whoop. Nope. Okay. Sorry about that. We just want you to be kind, empathetic, treat each other with respect, and assume positive intent. So no negative comments. All right. So for the breakout rooms, we're going to ask that you get your LinkedIn profile, your link to your LinkedIn ready, because we have you drop that in the chat. That just sticks in the chat while you're in the breakout room. So get that ready so that you can connect with people in your chat. And so for the first room, we're going to have a fun question. What do you like to do on either a sunny day or a rainy day? So just something a little silly to have a good time with. I'm going to go ahead and start setting up the breakout rooms. And again, we'll just do like 12 minutes or so. We'll come back, see how that time works for everybody. And then we'll come back to to the main lobby and see, have a quick transition, and then we'll do the next question. So you have to hit join. So have your LinkedIn profile ready, and you're going to say your name, what your specialty is. Are you a designer, researcher, or strategist? And then the first question is, how do you like to spend a rainy or sunny day? All right, I'm going to go ahead and create the rooms. Here we go. Hit join.
Is there any way to allow the name change on to just change our display names, or no?
I believe you just click on yourself and under the option, 3-dot option, it says to rename.
I think the moderator has to allow for that. For some reason, it's probably checked off as not allowed to do that. Just to let you know. I'll jump into a breakout now.
Yeah, we've had one problem in the past. So
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't see the option to change that. To thank you for recording that again. People really like this happy hour part. So if anybody has a question, go down to the reactions. Is it the reactions? And raise your hand in the emojis at the bottom, and raise your hand, and we'll start shooting questions out at the people. Oh, I know people have questions. Come on. Don't be shy. All right. We have one. Samahir. Forgive me if I'm ruining your name. Hi.
Hello.
What's your question?
So I'm actually in the process of looking at survey tools. I know that wasn't the focus of this, but curious I'm looking at Qualtrics, for example. I'm curious if anyone else has experience using different survey tools and why they might be good or why not. Yep.
I've used Qualtrics a little bit, and so off and on for about 2 years, depending on when I needed surveys. And it was difficult to figure out, but once you figure it out, it is an incredibly powerful tool. I've also used Google Forms, but it doesn't allow you to customize with branding. So it doesn't always look as professional as something like Qualtrics that can be customized with branding.
I think that's super helpful. Do you use any tools for like one-time surveys, or is it like a long-time contract sort of thing? And that'll be my final question.
I do think that Qualtrics is a long-term contract with the whole company. And anyone else, please speak up if I'm not correct about that. Google Forms is a one-off type of thing. I've also taken surveys on Typeform, which I think has a very clean interface. I didn't notice anywhere to do branding with that, but it seems like much cleaner and a little bit more professional than Google Forms.
Yeah, and I've used SurveyMonkey too, but they're like optimal sort. They keep changing their business model. So I think you used to be able to like pay for one survey, and now you may have to have a subscription, and there's different tiers and all the things. Their tool is kind of falls between Google Forms and Qualtrics. There's some logic you can build in. There's some display logic you can have, but it's not as powerful as Qualtrics is. And it just depends on if you have $40,000 or $50,000 or however much Qualtrics is these days to pay for it. Ask your marketing department if they'd like to share a license. Ask product if they want to share a license. So see if anybody else can put money into the bucket for you to get a big tool, and then you can share some of the seats with them too. That's always an option.
Perfect.
I was gonna second that. I think if you have some of the wealth of your other research insight disciplines to spread around your tool, because Qualtrics is incredibly powerful. It's even more powerful if you have like a market researcher that can help you unlock a little bit more of the, whether it's kind of like conjoint type tests to even kind of scale the insights that you might have from one particular type of research, but it costs a lot. Typeform I've used kind of in a pinch as well. They look great. Like someone said, it's kind of like a in between Google Forms and Qualtrics. They are. I would feel like Typeform is fairly straightforward, and the surveys come out looking great, and some of the quick analysis that comes out of it is fairly easy to consume as well. But it's also not as customizable as the Qualtrics platform. But the Qualtrics platform has so many things you can you can basically build a panel. And over time, it kind of turns into kind of its own kind of CRM for your users. But again, I don't even know how much they cost, to Lori's point.
That's amazing.
I think the cost is very dependent on number of licenses, and you're a big organization, you got deep pockets, we're going to charge you more. Like it's you can't go on a site and see, this is what they charge. I think that every content with those services, I think they're very custom. So
you can I'm sorry, I'm just going to say, as far as the price goes, you can always use like Power BI, which has a free version, and that gives you good, descriptive data as well. At our place, we don't use, we run all our own statistical models, writing our own, like we'll use SPSS, SAS, or we write our own Python models for it. Because what I find limitations with all those, whether it's Google survey or you can't write any model comparisons to do predictive programming really. So we use only statistical analysis and not canned not canned output is what I'm saying. The Power BI is free.
cool.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll look into that for sure.
All right. Great. Thank you. Stephanie, you're next up on my screen. What's your question? Unmute.
Hello, everyone.
I-
I have a degree in web design, and I haven't designed a website in about 3 or 4 years, at least not on an ongoing basis. I'm a caregiver now, so that's pretty much my full-time job, but I really want to get back into actually user experience design. I do have some experience, well, I have some exposure to user experience research. That's really not the area that I want to get into. But since I'm just kind of getting my feet wet again, I was wondering if you all would like to share some knowledge as to where I could find resources, because I know that the industry has changed quite a bit. So I'm pretty much starting over again.
Stephanie, what kind of resources are you looking for?
Oh my gosh. I honestly, you guys are the first. This is my initial resource. So, but mostly I've started with what is it, XD with wireframing. But really I kind of I don't know where to start because I kind of feel overwhelmed in my search.
You're trying, did I hear correctly? You want to do product design, user experience design?
Product design or web design.
Web design or product design? They're two different
Web
things.
design.
Web design. So
yes.
So web design, it really is, I would say, okay, product design. There's so many different layers. Do you want to code or do you just want to draw wireframes and do a visual design? Do you want to code or do you want to use tools like Figma, Sketch, Adobe XD?
Yes, Adobe XD and Figma, yes.
I would recommend taking some classes from General Assembly. They have boot camps, they have classes in all the major cities in the US. I would start with them. And then, I mean, you could do Google search. Many universities like Coursera has classes from all the major universities in the US, University of Michigan, Stanford, Harvard, all the big schools. But I would if you're just starting to refresh some of the knowledge that you have, General Assembly, I think, has quality instructors and reasonable pricing.
Okay.
Also, General Assembly is good if you want, the boot camp is good if you want to put together a portfolio or update your portfolio. They'll kind of, help you with that. And there's also LinkedIn Learning. There are a lot of good courses on LinkedIn Learning.
Okay, thank you.
And if you have a premium account, they're free.
Okay, I have to do that.
I think also Google just came out with a UX certificate as well for an online course if you want to take that for UX. I've heard good things. I haven't taken it, but I've heard good things, so it might be worth checking out.
Yeah, Floria, I think they're on Coursera, I believe. And I think that's a good resource to start with because it's free. Like General Assembly is pretty expensive. So that Google certification is very beginner level.
Mm-hmm.
At least I thought so. And it gives a good overview of the different aspects of UX. And that might give you an idea of what you actually want to deeper dive into.
Okay.
So you can go on to Coursera and just audit the course to just watch the videos. And there's other courses because Coursera is not free for all the classes either. I think Scott Clemmer's class on interaction design is really good on Coursera as well. But sometimes you can audit the courses and just watch the videos for free. So that would be my recommendation. And sometimes Udemy also has some videos that you could maybe $10-15 for and just kind of get an idea. I know I mean there's, for every question you have, there's a million resources to be thrown at you. So it's really difficult when you're like, I want resources. I'm like, oh my goodness, Google. I mean, there's a resource, but I know there's a million things on there.
Right.
But
also, you may want to think about, is there any kind of specialization that you're interested in? Or do you just are you interested in just being a general web designer? Or if you have an area of specialization, then you can hone your learning to that.
Yes, I think I'm going to start kind of broad, not too broad, but then kind of narrow down to one specialty. So
yeah. Stephanie, I was just going to say, I know this wasn't your question. You're kind of looking for places to go, but I think the people that you can find to kind of help guide you in this process is going to be, worth 100 links. Because, the answer is it always depends. And that there's a lot of reasons for that. So I think having someone help you kind of just navigate this world, and someone that knows about where the ends are, they really aren't, but that, and like meetups, a lot of them are digital now too. And there's a lot of mentorship programs that happen through that, but you're in the right place. You're doing it. You're doing the learning, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, on Christian's comment, ADP list is a good place to find a mentor, free. There's loads of designers on there. You find yourself a UX designer and make some connections, make some relationships, and ask for some guidance. You might get a few different opinions, but I think that's a good place to find a mentor.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
One last comment as far as when you're saying looking at LinkedIn Learning at Coursera, depending on where you live, a lot of those programs have free access through your library system. So if you have a library card, I don't know your area, but most areas, if you have a library card, you can use your library card and get all free access to all that information.
Oh, I will get one.
So I've got a question. How can I encourage product managers to write better surveys? So here are some things that I've tried. I've shared some articles that Stripe has used that also has a democratized research strategy. I have talked to people and helped them write a couple of surveys, but I would love to start everyone who is a product manager writing better surveys. So if you have any strategies about how to do that, please let me know.
Do you have any success stories yet, Lauren, for the people you've helped?
So I have some success with ones that I have very specifically helped write. And then I've seen people who have been successful come back and ask for help on the next one. But in terms of like a broad, system change, I have not been successful.
Should program managers be writing surveys?
Product managers, should they? Look, they don't have any data, and when there's only just one of me, I just can't write all of them.
Language that you can't either, but like when it comes from a product manager, sometimes it's different than when it comes from a UX researcher. So you could try that. And I would keep up the mentoring. Bring me your questions. Let me help you. Bring me the things that have failed. Let's talk about why those questions failed, why those surveys didn't get you what you were hoping to find, and continue to keep fishing for new opportunities to help them, because that's the only thing that I've ever seen truly make a difference. The more they can experience what a good survey looks and feels and gives them data like, the more they'll want that, and the more that they'll learn and they'll really internalize what you're trying to teach them.
Yeah, I think along those points, so I'm not a researcher, but I'm trying to convince my product managers to kind of step away from the survey and let a researcher write it. And for the purpose of when it's done properly, it can answer questions that you don't even have yet, and it'll keep feeding kind of the questions for the next year. I've seen that happen before. So it's kind of like proving out what a high quality survey can do. But I guess that would only lead to helping you find more researchers on your team or something like that, which would be a good thing.
Yeah, are you able to review their questions and maybe work through like why double-barreled or leading questions don't produce the data that they're hoping for?
That would be pretty great if I could, but there's nothing stopping them from doing 100 Pendo surveys.
But can you
so is the
actually
problem? Oh, sorry. Is the problem is that they're just popping up a bunch of Pendo pop-ups and they're just like for every little thing? 'Cause I know how that goes.
So between Qualaroo and Pendo, many product managers, I mean, and then so there's like some checks for customers, but there's no checks for internal ones. And the check for current customers is going through marketing because marketing controls or mostly controls like the front of site. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Maybe like to what Lori was saying is come up with some success stories of showing the value of surveys coming out of the UX research department, not just the marketing department, and show the difference in the data that you get. And, you know, how is it actionable versus maybe not? I mean, I don't know the questions you're asking, but if you're very intentional in the survey that you design and you really provide data for the team to take action on, I mean, that is a good success story that you could be circulating.
Absolutely.
And sorry, Cindy, I cut you off earlier. Please go.
I was going to say that we experienced like a similar problem at my organization. And what we ended up doing was when we went into our next contract with SurveyMonkey, we basically told them that anyone that wanted to use our domain to create a survey had to ask for authorization. So if SurveyMonkey has, I'm sure like if you're using Qualtrics or some other product, they might also offer that. And then we were able to basically like pre-screen their questions and then, or like help them. What we ended up doing, because the surveys were like all over the place and some surveys were like literally like 80 questions, like we just ended up working one-on-one with them, being like, okay, I need to create the survey. You no longer have access to like survey creation, and just like coaching them. And so there's currently at the organization, there's like 4 people that we are like good with them creating their own surveys. The other ones haven't earned that yet, but now they see it as, if I want to do that and I don't want to wait for 2 weeks while Cindy makes a survey, then I have to be good at it. So that's like their like carrot at the end of the stick.
How have you got to the point where you've had enough influence in the organization that you've said, okay, like everyone has to go through us, right? Like, so at present, marketing is like, you have to go through us. And they have like a lot of influence in the organization. But right now UX research is just me. So I'm curious, like what steps has your org taken to get to that point?
What department are you in?
UX.
UX, but it's only you, and who do you report directly to?
I report to the head of design. And he reports to product, the vice president of product.
Is he like at the same level than the marketing team? I would go to the person that is at the same level or ahead of the marketing team to be able to do that. So when we started having that problem, I am in innovation. My boss is a chief innovation officer, and marketing, they only have a director. So we were like, you are a chief, they are a director, we win.
Yeah, I'm not sure that will work.
There you go.
I was
sorry. I was just going to comment. I've never found very much success in forcing it or going above people's heads. But what we've done, and maybe you can do the same thing, Lauren, we've done, I don't know if you have an internal training program or internal professional development series. At where we're at, we offer internal training and professional development. And I actually covered this topic in my training. It's titled the Type 6 Error. And if you're familiar with statistics, a type 6 error is when you get the answer, but you asked the wrong question. And I think that's the very first time that they realized that the question is really important more than the answer. So but I do it through training programs. So if you have an internal training program or professional development, we've had good results. I've had good results with that in my organization.
That's a good idea.
Joe, did you have something you wanted to add?
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna kind of to add to, I think, Cindy's point, there is like something that's useful in kind of creating a process, but kind of maybe positioning it more as kind of quality control, but also like if you have 10 product managers all sending out surveys on their own, they're unchecked, right? There's probably duplication of effort. And if they're not quite, up to speed on practices, probably not useful effort. So something that I think I've in past organizations is kind of partnering with that marketing person or that marketing org to kind of be like, hey, we've got this survey stuff going on, like maybe you can control maybe an informal gate of, quality checks before they go out. So you can maybe soft step your control over that process, but then also kind of pitching the efficiency gains if you are able to control the amount and volume of product manager surveys that are going out, because then you can also start building a battery of questions and be like, hey, product manager, Sam has this question, but you working in this part of the company have this other question. Let's kind of disseminate this particular survey in a way that answers both of those questions, or, don't send them together or close together because you're going to kind of mess up your sample. So I think there are some arguments that you can make in either partnering with that marketing person to kind of begin to control a little bit of that process, but also for the product manager side, you don't want to kind of like discourage them to be inquisitive, but you also want to help them kind of be more efficient with their time, with you as the partner and your marketing team as a partner. So I don't know if that gives you some clear steps, but like maybe, some way to strategize how you kind of get more control over that process.
That's a great,
yeah, Joe, that was a great point. I think that the term survey fatigue has gotten some legs in our company, at least, because we not only survey our internal folks way too much, but we also do the same to our customers. So your data quality is going down every time you do another survey, on the same day, exactly. So that was kind of my thought. And then I also wanted to kind of double tap on something Lori was saying, where, finding those champions and those success stories, it's not even necessarily about you telling those stories. And that's something that I'm now realizing the power of a lot more. Like when it comes from my mouth, it gets heard different than if it gets heard from somebody's peer, right? So however you can encourage those people that you are having success with to tell that story to other people that you're trying to get to, I think that has there's a lot more to that than I ever really recognized, kind of. So
cool. Thanks, Kristen. Appreciate that. Yvonne, you have your hand up next.
Yeah.
What's your question?
I'll keep my last question short. So I'm curious about any of you guys have experience in doing user research and accessibility. And like, if so, what kind of resource, like recruitment processes, and yeah.
This is a good question.
I
We
don't
get it
have
a
any-
lot.
I don't have any experience doing research for accessibility. I have experience doing design for accessibility, but I think for accessing like participants to do research with, I think most agencies where you can, recruitment agencies would be able to focus on that. I mean, I think they have specialized ones that focus on handicapped and accessible needs people. So I think that I mean, unless you're working for a company where your clients are, handicapped or have accessibility issues, but I'm pretty sure that any kind of recruitment agency or specialized recruitment agencies could help you.
Yeah, somebody dropped it in the chat, the Fable company. I would recommend them.
Mm-hmm. We recently conducted research that was focused on individuals with disabilities, and we had great success working with our usual recruitment agency that we work with for finding our participants. And I think the other considerations that we took into play were some of the language that we use, especially in consideration for individuals using screen readers. kind of prepping individuals what the tools will be using. So if you're using Zoom or any other platform or something, wherever you're conducting your research, just letting people know how to be prepared to participate. That was a consideration that we also used. We also consulted with Fable, but we're happily successful using our usual recruitment agency. So,
thank you.
I think Fable does a lot of like talks if you're looking to just kind of learn more about it. I know Rosenfeld Media has brought them on as a sponsor before, so their talks are available if you rosenfeldmedia.com and you kind of look through their conference schedules. They've had some good talks, and they're always, I mean, for sponsor sessions, they're insanely informative.
Gotcha.
Cool. Anybody else have one more last burning question before we call it an evening? Bobby Bishop, your dog does. I can tell by his tail. He's got a
I have
burning
a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you guys have any sources on knowing which is the correct methodology to choose for a case study?
To put into a case study, or what do you mean?
Like which method to choose, or methodology, I believe is what it's also known as.
Mm-hmm.
Like in other words, because I'm still a student and all of this is very new to me.
Okay.
And so one of the things that I've come across is ensuring that you have that you're choosing the correct method when beginning a case study. And I've Googled this a good amount of times, but I just sometimes feel like I'm getting stuck in a loop.
I think you're getting because you don't Google what method to use for a case study. You have to start with the problem. What is the thing that you are trying to find the answer to? Then you decide the method that will help you get the answers to that problem. Then you build your case study around with the information that you gathered as you went through that process. The case study is something that comes completely after you are done with the project, that is the research project. They are not the same thing.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, a case study is a summary, like a portfolio piece. It's a summary of the work that you did. So it could be a design focused case study, or it could be research, and you could have one method discussed in your case story, or you could have multi methods depending on what you did for the project. So I just threw a link in the chat, Mike.
I got it. Thank you. Yeah.
A video that our group presented on that talks about the different research methods and what to use when. So check that out, and that will help you get a better understanding of just what I said, what the different methods are and when to use them for what problem you're trying to solve, like Lori was talking about. And then when it comes to case studies, we actually have, it's like, Mike, it's like you teed this up and you didn't even know it. We have Lori is going to be giving a talk here. Is it March? February, right? March. You're muted. She said it's March. And she's going to be giving, Lori, you talk about it.
I can. So I am going to give a webinar. So this is going to be paid. It's only $25, or in your local currency. And it's going to be a whole presentation on how to actually create a UX research portfolio. We're going to go through the elements of what a case study is, what you should have in it. We're going to go through what the heck do you do with your portfolio now you have one? Who's going to look at it? How do you use it to get the job that you actually want? And a whole bunch of other questions, like what do I do with a non-disclosure agreement? How do I show stuff if I can't show stuff? And all those questions everybody always has. And then we're also going to have a Q&A after. So the last time I did this, the presentation went for like an hour and a half, and I did Q&A for another hour, I think it was. And so I've scheduled it from like 5 to 8 Central Time. So we're going to have enough time to really get into the topic at hand and answer your questions for it. So
That is something I'm definitely interested in. You said it was only going to cost 25 bald eagles, right?
Yep. And you have lifetime access to watch it. So you can refer to it anytime you need to redo your portfolio. I threw the link in the chat.
Thank
The
you very
date
much.
is March 16th. So if you can't attend it live, you can still buy your ticket and then you can watch the recording later. This will not be posted on YouTube. This will not be available to the general public. So this is a very special event.
Ooh, I'm feeling special already.
Oh, I love it. All right. Well, if that's it for the questions, thank you so much for hanging out and enjoying happy hour with us. And hopefully we'll see you at the next networking event, which I believe we threw that in the chat. That's February. I'm trying to remember the date. Just go to Eventbrite, look up UX research and strategy. We have 4 events happening. This is coming up. So get tickets to all the things because we have a lot of great stuff coming up. So we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
You,
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.